The Filipino martial arts catalog of swords is endlessly interesting because there's so many varieties of designs. You have the Chris swords, you have the Talibong series, you have the Barong, but of course you also have the northern designs which are embodied by Pinuti series, the Katipunero, but of course the ever popular Itak Tagalog sword. This is one of my favorites. I got this from Ron Kozakowski at Traditional Filipino Weapons, and it's one of my favorites. It taught me a lot about weapons work. However, since this video is about the Ginunting, what we want to try to answer in this video is, well, what are the techniques that best encapsulate and optimize the use of the Ginunting in a combative setting? So this is important for us to take a look at because, as you saw in my previous video, the neural sequencing and the biomechanics for the use of the Ginunting is very different from the use of the Itak Tagalog. Because when you saw in that video, when I tried to use the biomechanics of the Ginunting, which is very arm-centric, with the Itak Tagalog, and I was just using a talim trainer, I was just using a wooden version of it, I ended up hitting the wall of all things. And in all of my time on this channel, I've never hit anything with any of my weapons. So I thought that was very telling. Let's examine the design difference and weight distribution differences of each sword. One I've already referenced in the first video, in that the Itak Tagalog and the majority of swords in Southeast Asia have some form of belly swell along the edge, which you can see right about here. So it's not a straight edge. You see it here, it's about straight, and then all of a sudden it curves out. And what that does is that when I let the sword drop, it has this momentum. That momentum translates into weight. And that's where I referenced in my first video, where you need a kind of power stop. For instance, if I were to cut across angle number 3, and this sword is traveling really super fast, if I don't stop it in any way, this sword can keep on going. But if I need it to redirect and I'm coming across, I can stop. I can actually put a stop to it, either along the wrist, the forearm, or the bicep, or even on my opposite shoulder, because something has to stop that momentum. Because when that sword moves on its own and that belly swell is moving at a certain rate, it's really hard to do with your hand. If you end up using it just with your hand, well, I'm just gonna muscle through it. The issue is now your entire movement quality is not that good, so you're gonna lose some timing when you try to redirect with your hand. It's doable, but it's not optimal. This is the opposite with the Ginunting. So the Ginunting has no belly swell, and as a result of it, it's actually very light. So if I come across this way, I can redirect using the edge along the tip very quickly. So this movement here is very simple. As I cut across, I can redirect it and cut across the other way. So there's something to be said about what's optimal for both in terms of use and technique. One thing I will say about the Itak Tagalog is that this is really great for payong movements, where you cut across and then go into payong and then cut right across again. That way you see that fluid interplay of shoulder dynamics, so that I lead with the right shoulder, payong and block, lead with the left shoulder to clear, and then come right across with the lead shoulder again. That, I think, is very well optimized for the Itak Tagalog. It's pretty standard. In fact, it's something that you see a lot in the use of the Itak. Very different with the Ginunting. Because the Ginunting, as you saw in the first video, if I were to try to do this movement, I don't feel anything in my core because the weight is just not there. It doesn't have that kind of weight distribution. So it tends to work better with these types of movements where the elbow is in, keeping the hand within the width of the torso, is something that you see a lot in Ilustrisimo, but something you also see a lot in Hiron. So when I took a look at some of my notes in the Hiron Eskrima style, one of the things that I did happen to like was this low stance that Hiron happens to have. And it's very important to kind of think about, because in Leo Hiron's system, since he was a World War II veteran, one of the things he liked to point out is that the kind of stances, the kind of positions that you have to take in terms of anchoring, which is found in the estilo DeFondo, when you start to lower yourself, you have to think about the evenness of the ground. So meaning when you get really low, sometimes you have to expect that that slopes downward or sometimes it slopes upward. But regardless of that, you have to kind of anchor yourself in your core. And those weren't his words. When I was using that specific technique, you have to kind of anchor yourself in a way that's very optimal for you. Also be aware that sometimes, especially in the combative context that he was working in, you weren't necessarily working in a very solid grounding. Sometimes the grounding is downward or upward, or it's very slippery, it's very muddy, which is what he fought in World War II in the jungles of the Philippines. So what I like to do with the Ginunting, there's two techniques that I really like. And one of them is the punch cut from Kalis Ilustrisimo, which indexes along the ribs of the body. I happen to like this. But also this rooftop movement. Now payong, which is umbrella, which is different from rooftop. Because when you do rooftop, it's parallel to the ground. Whereas when you do payong, it forms a 45-degree angle to the horizon. So there's rooftop and then there's payong. What I've found is when I do a payong movement, I lose that kinesthetic awareness in my core so that it's more coiled, but it's a little different when I go overhead and it's more of a modified rooftop. So now it is parallel to my core. Right about here, for some strange reason, I can start to feel my core reflexively trying to coil. Versus if I were to do this with the Itag, you can already see my wrist wanting to bend. With that kind of bend, it's going to want to go more into this payong movement, which makes sense. So if I'm here, do a little bit of a rooftop, becomes a payong, so it glides right off my sword, and then I go straight into the cut. What I'm going to do, and what I found to be optimal for the use of the sword, is the punch cut, which goes into a rooftop, which cuts right across. But what's cool about that is because of the edge here, I can reverse it and then come down back into that angle one. So far in my use of this Ginunting, I think this is what's optimal about it for several reasons. One, you can change levels with that kind of DeFondo stance, but also number two, you can start to engage your core in that position and in that movement, so you can see this really fast movement with the sword, which is already designed for speed. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for letting me share. I'm going to be moving with both. One is not better than the other. It just requires a different set of biomechanics and neural sequencing. And what I want to highlight in this video is that the tool educates us and gives us an opportunity to explore different neural sequences and biomechanics so that we can optimize our movement with them in the specific combative context that we are choosing. So thank you very much for letting me share this video. I really hope you enjoy. Let's first take a look at the Itak Tagalog, which is the more core-centric between the two swords. Notice how my elbows and hip work in conjunction together in a way that is coordinated, while my right hand is staying within the width of my entire torso. Notice how my right hand stays right below my armpit, right next to the rib, which is the position for the Kalis Ilustrisimo Punch Cut, which is a very versatile position for a very powerful angle one. But in this instance, we're going to go and move with an angle number 2 with a lutang footwork. Although the biomechanics of Kalis Ilustrisimo is one of the most effective in terms of efficiently using the Itak Tagalog, it cannot 100% overcome one of its design drawbacks, which is that belly swell, which initially is great for chopping by delivering a great momentum. However, it forces the hand to lead with steel trailing, which exposes the hand to all types of counterattacks. It cannot completely overcome what, in my opinion, is a design drawback. We can try to make some adjustments to it, but it does end up jacking up the shoulders. So any sort of movement that can try to mitigate this type of design drawback is not going to be enough. Although some technical adjustments can be made to try to mitigate this design drawback, fundamentally it still exposes the hand even when these techniques are relatively basic and easy to execute. So when you see me do this slash, you'll see that my hand is actually leading the edge. Very drastic adjustment has to be made. For instance, a postural change, as you see here, this type of level change that you often see in Heron Eskrima, specifically in their DeFondo style. Now let's take a look at the Bigler Ginunting, and we'll do a comparison of hand positions relative to the tip of the sword. So when you see me move around with it, remember that hand position with the Itag, because what you'll see here is that the tip is angled such so that it is in fact ahead of my knuckles. This is what I meant where steel can lead flesh. But as you can see with this angle number 2, that slightly angled tip, which is very severe, although effective in certain angles, it doesn't solve it for all angles. So we still have to use some sort of biomechanical change in this. And one of the things that I like to use and I've discovered while training with this Ginunting is a very similar level change that you saw with the DeFondo style that I showed earlier with the Itak Tagalog. A sudden advancing level change allows me to go into that rooftop block and cut right across into the carotid. Remember that the rooftop is parallel to the ground, where a payong, the umbrella, actually angles off at a 45-degree angle. This is something that you see more prevalent with the Itak Tagalog because it happens to be heavier and it leaves you no choice but to go into a payong. Although I referenced the rooftop block to initially position the tool, the technique actually comes from Native American tomahawk. In the time that I've had to practice with the Bigler Ginunting, I am of the belief that the DeFondo stance and posture is what optimizes this Ginunting design best. Even though it is still very good at a standing posture where it's nice and tall, so if you take a look at how I hold it with the neutral wrist, see how the sword still leans forward. So it still has that steel leading flesh capabilities, especially when it's coming from the right shoulder and then downward. It still has some capabilities for this if it's from the left shoulder, but it will require some distance management. But for this video, we're going to take some level changes and postural changes, allowing me to utilize arm-centric movements with steel leading flesh while being anchored in a DeFondo stance that is very stable for me. Notice that from this position of stability, I can use a lot of arm-centric movements while not being disturbed from the perspective of equilibrium and balance. Another way for us to optimize the Ginunting is to transition into a tall posture, position the right hand into that punch cut position, and use snap cuts exclusively. Because of the severe forward angle of the Ginunting, we can expect it to move very quickly into a snap cut and allow it to protect the hand so that the steel leads flesh. A snap cut is something that we cannot use with the traditional Itak Tagalog because of the belly swell that we saw earlier. We now have two ways to optimize our attacks when it comes to the Bigler Ginunting. One of them is a tall posture snap cut, and then the other one is a very deliberate and intentional level change, and utilize the DeFondo style where we level change, take the rear leg back, and as we take that rear leg back, we take the hand over the head and the sword goes over into a roof block position, and from there cut across into the carotid and fire our attacks from that low stance. The beauty of these types of combinations is that it is posturally and biomechanically driven. Muhammad Ali has traditionally used a tall posture to whip out his jabs, while Mike Tyson used lowered stances to rotate and fire off those powerful body hooks. The Ginunting is a very good example of how a very close analysis of design can actually dictate the strategy of the practitioner, because if we were to take a look at the design of the Itak Tagalog, although we could possibly do it with this exact strategy, it is not optimized for it because of its heavier design. Now I want you to pay very close attention to how the Ginunting moves in this exact combination and posture, which I believe optimizes it and I think is specific to the Ginunting. Now let's take a look at it with the use of the Itak Tagalog. Same exact thing, coming from tall posture, then we're going to switch into the DeFondo, but when you see the DeFondo stance, it forces my Itak to actually fall forward because of that belly swell. That belly swell actually works as a very heavy weight, which is good for momentum, but not good for arm-centric movement. See how it pulls my body forward? So it forces me to go into this hip hinge, which now makes me very unstable. There has to be some adjustments, like some power stopping with the left hand to make it work. So it can work in that exact posture with the Itak Tagalog, but it has to be adjusted and optimized for it. Now let's go back to the Ginunting. Same exact combination, but now with the snap cuts from tall posture. Another adjustment that we're going to have is we're going to use the left hand. So after we fire off this snap cut, we're going to do a two-handed movement. Remember that the traditional Ginunting actually had bigger handles, a bigger pommel that allows it to be half-handed, which is something that Brian Bigler confirmed with me. He adjusted the handle on the Bigler Ginunting so that it's primarily one-handed, but also for its balance. So take a look at how easily I can move with the Bigler Ginunting, especially when I go into that DeFondo stance. Notice how when I move along the transverse plane, it doesn't disturb my equilibrium at all, but it still allows for two-handing. That's something that I really like about the Bigler Ginunting, because there's an element of traditionalism with it where I can two-hand it, but also use it one-handed for its lightness. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.